Welcome everyone to the Nerd Journey Podcast, episode number 218. We're joining you every week to talk IT career progression and bring you the advice we wish we'd been given earlier in our careers. I'm your host, Nick Cordy, at NetworkNerd_ on Twitter, filling in for my normal co-host, John White, at VJourneyman. We are a couple of pre-sales technical engineers with backgrounds in IT operations. We hope our career discussions will be vendor neutral, relevant across disciplines, and remain timeless. If you're enjoying our content, please drop us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you subscribe. And if you want to get in touch with us, tweet or DM at Nerd Journey. Ultimately, we're just two nerds on a journey to career enlightenment. So let's take a trip. Hey everybody, this is the first episode in our new series of interviews with Jason Langer. He's a product marketing manager at Pure Storage today, but he didn't start out that way. In fact, in this episode, part one of our discussion with Jason, you're going to hear about his first job in tech and how that taught him some very interesting communication skills. In fact, he was forced to learn those communication skills to be good at this particular job. I won't spoil what it is. Jason describes his early career as being focused on gaining and learning new skills. And that goes along nicely with a great discussion he and I have about asking for more opportunities. As you gain experience, as you want to learn more, as you want to work on new things or new areas, asking for more opportunities. He also shares a story about getting laid off. I know that is something that's top of mind for a lot of listeners out there, so listen closely to hear how Jason dealt with it. We'll also hear how Jason did technology solution deployments for a value-added reseller. And he made a move from that position into more of a technical architecture role. What was that transition like, and what's the difference really? And then we'll hear how he became a practice manager at the value-added reseller. What does that even mean? Well, let's get to part one of our discussion with Jason Langer. Mr. Jason Langer, welcome to Nerd Journey.
Hey, Nick. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Let's start by telling the listeners a little bit about who you are.
Sure. So I am Jason Langer, as you said. I am currently a solutions marketing manager working at Pure Storage, who focuses on Pure Storage aspects as it relates to VMware and cloud solutions.
Well, here's what we're going to do, Jason. We're going to go into the Wayback Machine and start from the beginning, because someone doesn't come out of the gate from getting educated or straight out of high school and go into solution marketing. So tell us a little bit about how you got into tech and what made it interesting.
So you are going back in the Wayback Machine. My first actual tech job was in 1998, and I did phone technical support for a company called Sierra Online. And I made a whopping $6 an hour helping people create and make bootable DOS disks, so they could free up enough memory to play classic video games like Red Barron or Leisure Suit Larry, if anybody is old enough to remember those games. So that's where that was actually my first paid IT job. But what got me there is, I'm sure like a lot of folks that I've heard on your podcast, or you probably yourself, is I was a gamer early on. You know, Atari 2600 when I was a kid. First computer was a Commodore 64, Amigas, you know, the whole line of Nintendos, of course.
Of course.
And then I bought my first PC in 1994. I built it because I couldn't afford like a Dell or like a Hewlett Packard or whatever the off the shelf stuff was, and it was an AMD K5. Ever since then, been building my own PCs. Got a water cooled one I'm looking at right now for my gaming, and that's just kind of what the start was. And that, as you said, I started at a video game company doing tech support, and then it grew into learning servers and storage and networking and VMware and all this other stuff. But yeah, that was kind of the beginning of it. And I thank my parents for that. My dad bought us the Commodore 64. He snuck us in a 5140 floppy drive for my brother and I. And yeah, we played games on it all the time.
Oh, that's interesting. A lot of folks have cited their parents as inspiring them or sort of enabling them to go down the path to, whether it was education or ability to work with a specific technology or influence because they worked in the technology field and recommended it for. So that's a common thread that I'm calling out right now. So that's good. You fit the pattern. That's a first check mark.
I fit a type. Yeah. But when I bought my first PC, my parents co-signed for me to get a personal loan to buy it, and it was their way for teaching me how credit worked.
Nice.
So yeah, because it was like $1,600, and they're like, no, this would be a good idea for you to work, and you have a monthly bill, and you would establish credit, and that's a whole other nerd journey conversation about teaching IT people how to use manage their money.
It's an important one.
Yeah, they were always super supportive of it, and my dad used to play the games with us too, and all that stuff. So it was always great.
I think the money management's going to come into a different part of our conversation later on. We'll save that one.
Foreshadowing.
The phone support. So this is consumer phone support working with video game players to create these things. Yeah. What was their level of technical knowledge? Was it literally, okay, this is a disc, this is where you plug it in, or how intricate was that and how challenging was it?
Yeah, most of that was phone. What you tried to do, quite honestly, was get them to email, because you're sending them text of like DOS commands, like HIMEM 86. I can't remember all of them, but and you're like, all right, now you need to format this floppy, right? And you might walk them through that on the phone, but you're like, all right, once you format it, now copy paste or type in this text.
And there's no screen sharing.
Yeah, there's no screen sharing.
It wasn't a thing.
You got really good, and it ties into the next job I did after that. You got really good at describing things. Because I did phone tech support at Starbucks as well, for corporate at that point. But you're telling people, like, look for the blue and yellow thing that's shaped like, an octagon or whatever when you're plugging it in. And yeah, it was an interesting job. We had a game called Pro Pilot. So flight sims, I think 1998 flight sims, USB wasn't out yet. So you're dealing with parallel ports and daisy chaining of flight yokes, Windows 95, maybe 98. I look back at it and I just kind of laugh, like it was kind of crazy, and but it was a great learning experience. You got used to talking to people on the phone, or or like what we're doing over Zoom or over the podcast software, and that led to going into Starbucks and again doing technical support for the stores, right? So if a store had a problem, because all the terminals, the pay terminals, they're networked together and they phone home back to the mothership and this stuff, and I'm like, okay, you got to reboot the modem. I'm like, well, what's the modem? I'm like, okay, it's a Centercom modem. It's gray. It's got rainbow stripes on it. It's going to be about 6x4. Probably should be under the desk. So you were describing these things and walking people through how to troubleshoot this stuff that obviously, are not, technology's not their background or not what their expertise are, or you're trying to help them, like, okay, I want to dial into your system. Walk them through like how to do that. So, and then of course there was corporate users too that called up and like, my Office isn't working. I'm having problems with Word or whatever. So I did that for about 2 years between the two, and it was a very good learning lesson. I carried that through my whole career of always looking at other folks and knowing if they had a technical support background, they kind of knew you had like this like badge of honor, this like scar. You've probably been called the worst things possible, or you've dealt with some really troublesome problems or whatnot, and you're just there trying to help people.
Yeah, for sure. You deal with some folks who are really frustrated, really upset, and they just want something fixed as quickly as you can do it. And you're the person who has to figure it out, and it may actually be a problem that you've never had to solve. But what's super interesting here, Jason, is that you had to figure out what the tech savviness level of the person on the other end of the phone was, and cater your explanation to fit that profile. So to your point, if they knew what the modem was, cool. That's easy. That's great. If they don't even know what a modem is, that takes a little more explanation. That takes a little bit longer. My theory is that as you talk to more people with different ranges of experience, you're able to get a faster sense of someone's experience when you get on the phone with them and can solve problems a lot faster as a result.
For sure. You can tell vice versa. You can tell by if maybe they've had a similar problem before and maybe they've called support. And so they might be familiar with it, right? For my whole career, that's always been really helpful of like, sometimes you have to explain hard concepts in very simple terms.
Yeah.
Right. And you start kind of digging through your bag of analogies or things that that are going to cross a lot of gaps for folks, right? Like certain, everybody knows about a car or understands how a car works. If you kind of use that as an analogy or whatever, right? So you kind of just get creative and try to find these descriptive ways of solving some problems that's not really about the technology or the piece of equipment itself. It's like you're just trying to identify it for them.
Yeah. And you may even have to say, hey, Jason, when you say car and I say car, I don't think we're talking about the same thing based on what you just told me.
Yeah. My car has 6 wheels. And you're like, well, mine has 4.
You expect to be able to drive at 120, but we don't have an Autobahn out here. So
right. Yeah.
It's not going to work. I love it. You actually worked for Disney at some point, the House of Mouse.
I did.
How'd that come about?
Again, I've kind of mentioned, like, there's a couple things that you're going to hear. Like we mentioned the pattern about video games. You're going to hear a thing about relationships throughout my story here, like my arc. So doing phone support jobs usually only lead to potentially more phone support jobs, unless you find a way to kind of break out of that. So then I started being at Starbucks. I got more into actual IT, like let's call it like corporate IT. Windows Active Directory didn't exist yet when I was there. So I was like learning more about NetWare and permissions and file shares. I'm like, oh, this is kind of cool. Like it kind of started to scratch an itch. So I bought my first like Windows NT4 book, like TCP/IP book or whatever, like for one of the early MCSC exams, right? Just to kind of like, and I worked graveyard. I worked graveyard at Starbucks. So at night when the phone wasn't ringing, I was reading the super hotness of a TCP/IP book, at 2:00 in the morning, trying to stay awake.
With a cup of Starbucks coffee beside you or no?
Yeah, of course. You had all the coffee you could drink. That's a staple. But yeah, so I was learning that stuff. And then my brother had a friend that was a systems admin at Walt Disney. Well, actually at the time it was called Go.com, if that rings a bell to anybody. We'll call it Disney for all intents and purposes. He worked on Disney Internet Group, which ran the web properties up here, which was all hosted out of Seattle. So I live up in Seattle. So ESPN.com, ABCnews.com, some other sites were actually hosted here in Seattle. And my brother had a friend that worked there, and they were just like, hey, I know a guy, the manager on the team is looking for a guy to come in and be a backup jockey, AKA just be the guy that backs up the servers. Doesn't pay a lot. It's a good gig. It's an entry level. And I'm like, sure, I'll go apply. So I applied, and the gentleman's name was Todd Johnson that I interviewed with. That was the manager. And for whatever reason, he hired me. I don't know if I was cheap enough or whatever, because I was making, at this time I was making like $12 an hour at Starbucks or something. So I became the backup guy at Walt Disney Internet Group in 2000. And this is back in physical server days, like one server to one web server, one server to a SQL server. Like we're in the way back time machine a little bit here. And I backed up, was responsible for backing up, something like 2,000 servers and cataloging DLT tapes and offsiting them and doing recoveries of email systems and stuff like that. So that's how I kind of started cutting my teeth in the whole Windows systems admin world.
I imagine even going from phone support to the backup person or backup resource was a route to a little bit higher paying gig. Is that accurate?
Yeah. I went to about $12 an hour to about $20 an hour.
Okay. Almost double.
I have no problem talking about it. So I'm just telling you, like, it was that journey. I was like, yeah, great. I'll do this. That sounds great. So
100%. And that's an important one for the people listening, because as you end up progressing, a lot of times some of the reason is monetary, right? You want to progress your career so that you can make more money and have more earning potential, but also do more things. So it's not that phone support is bad if you do that.
Yeah, no, remember, this is 2000. So folks listening now, they're probably like, that's not a lot of money. Like, this was 23 years ago now, right? So in that early time, it was all about learning new skills. And at that time, IT, not that IT's not hot now. I mean, it was like super hot, but that's back when they used to do the MCSC boot camps and all these kind of like paper cert stuff.
Microsoft Certified Systems Engineer, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
And it was like sometimes the best way to get more money was like, you're not waiting around at once a year for a 4% raise. You kind of job hopped a little bit, and your salary would go. You're like, oh, I'll be here for a year, learn some new skills, and now so and so is going to pay me X amount of more money. So maybe I go work over there for a little while.
And you were talking about even leveling up from the backup to learning networks, learning Windows.
Yeah, so I started off as the backup guy. So I had to learn at that time it was backup exec and Legato networker, which Dell EMC eventually bought. But then I started working on my first SAN. Like it should be like a toy box or something. But we deployed a HP EVA, which was one of the quote unquote first virtualized storage arrays. So that's when I started. So this is about 2001 or 2, if I remember right. So I started cutting my teeth on getting more into like storage and SAN, and it was fiber channel. I think it was 1 gig, maybe it was 2 gig fiber channel. Because they're like, hey, you're the backup guy. Why don't you learn? That's kind of data related. So why don't you learn a little bit more about storage? All that stuff was like early, especially this was .com days as well. Just learning something new, adding something else to the tool belt, and kind of learning it and getting starting that certification train. Like that's when it all kind of started for me early. Then it's like, okay, I'm going to go learn MIC data switches and get certified, or I'm going to go learn MCSE, NT4, and start getting certified, which of course we'll get into on the VM, like led into a whole bunch of VMware stuff, down the road. But again, that was kind of like the beginning of all that. I was 24, maybe 25, depending on what year that kind of falls into. But yeah, they all kind of just started building on top of each other. And it was just an opportunity of, hey, you're here. We've got this new thing. Can you do it? And it was like, yes, like just never, just say yes to the opportunity.
Yes, I will figure this out. I would love to learn that.
Yeah. Well, the first day when the SAN arrived, like I came in, the user manual was on my desk. A printed like manual of like 600, like a big thick book. How to use your EV. I can't remember what it said, but I'm like, oh, I guess I'm reading this. I guess I'm learning this.
Time to start taking notes.
Yeah.
So it sounds like different people made suggestions and you kept saying yes. Did that eventually turn into you asking for opportunities to jump into something new?
As I got further into my career, yes. As I got more comfortable, as I kind of got my sea legs, the more that probably came out more when I went to work at Microsoft. So Disney was great. Unfortunately, I had to leave Disney. The .com bubble did burst, and they laid off in November, no less, right before my birthday and Christmas. They laid off like 40% of the operating staff. Like they literally, like we all showed up, they put us in a conference room, and it was like, hey, when you guys leave, there's going to be a banker box on your desk.
Ooh.
I mean, they said it nicer than this, but like, sorry to say, you'll get a kit. There'll be a kit and blah, 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 blah. Really good financial lesson in that conversation that we, for your other podcast some other day. So that led me to being unemployed and then applying for jobs. And I landed at Microsoft, where we were building out some data centers for this thing called Xbox Live that hadn't actually launched yet. And they were looking for a guy to do the SAN stuff. And I was like, hey, I'll do that. Like I can do that. And, I've experienced with HP, and blah, 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 and so on and so forth. So it's more like, now it's like, okay, feel comfortable. Maybe I'm a level 150, not a level 100. I don't know. And then just kind of like going in and being more like asking, like to your point of like, hey, I think I can do that. How can I get involved in that project? Or how can I help with that piece of the build out? That type of stuff. And that, again, that started more so after I, again, felt more comfortable and had some experience and didn't feel like, hey, I'm the new guy that's just learning, Windows NT for the first time.
When you made those asks of, hey, I'd like to do this, it's very interesting, I'd like to learn that, what was the reception on the other end? I'm just curious, was it most of the time, oh, yeah, sure, or was it sometimes, you don't need to know about that?
A little bit of both. I mean, it's all dependent. On the Microsoft side, there was a rope that you had. Like I could go so far because I was working there as a vendor. I wasn't a full badged employee. So there were certain things that were kind of like, well, you can go this far, but since you're not a badged employee, there's stuff that we want to keep in house, for lack of a better term. And I understood that. I got it. Like I get it. There's some stuff that you want a badged employee to take care of or handle. Great, but they were my boss on that team and the team that we had around us. Like we had to do so much. The first year was about building out the data centers for the actual Xbox Live launch the following year. So it wasn't too terrible, but there were some limitations, and I understood that, and it didn't bother me because, like I said, I got it. If that might be a different conversation. Be like, well, then some of the questions of why, might come up. But
exactly,
I've always tried to try to be a little bit mindful of what's going on around me and not assume it's a slight or whatever. It's like, okay, that makes sense.
And maybe that's good advice for people listening. If you have asked to take on more work, something slightly adjacent to what you're doing, and had the door slammed on you, maybe it's something you don't see. Any other tips on people who may be getting shut down, asking to take on more things?
When that has happened, even later on in my career, because sometimes people are like, hey, we've got somebody else in mind. We're going to give that to Nick. And if it's my manager or whatever, I might follow up and be like, hey, that's great. I understand Nick is now going to run with it. I'm just curious, like, what could I do to be, I would ask the question, like, what could I do to be better positioned for the next opportunity? Or like, is there something that I need to learn? Or is there something more I need to be involved with? Or what, like, you have to kind of take control of your own career a little bit sometimes, but you also have to know when to do that, right? If you're not in good standings, or if it doesn't feel right, like, you just kind of say, got it, and you just kind of walk out the door or whatever. But there's other times, if it's something that was important to you and you want to know, ask those questions. And that goes to a lot of things, like if you're looking for promotions or whatever. And hopefully the other thing, though, hopefully you get valid feedback on those, right? And that's a whole other thing where, depending on who your management is and the manager side, hopefully you're getting the good, like, hey, well, Nick had experience here and we felt like you could use a little time, and then you say, well, and then you like, is there shadow opera? Like, there's just lots of ways to kind of stay active in that conversations. Like, hey, I'll take on the extra work. I'll be a shadow. I'll sit on the meetings. I won't say anything, like, just let me listen.
Yeah. The shadowing.
So it's like,
smart.
I'm a passive observer here.
I like that. That's what I was thinking too. Like, can I just shadow this person and try and learn some things from them? And of course, you have to worry about, is that person open to that? But I really like what you said about asking, because if you don't ask for what you want, it is very possible that whoever's leading the project, whether it's your boss or someone else, doesn't know that you wanted that, number one. Mm-hmm. And you're going to get an answer. It may not be the answer you want. And if it's not the answer you want, to Jason's point, well, what can I do to be ready for the next one or the next time? Or can I get in on this somehow? If it's not the best option, can we have the next best thing or good option?
Yeah, I just don't take it as a definitive. I mean, don't take it as the definitive. Just no. Follow up, ask some questions. But I mean, that mileage may vary depending on the situation. And everybody can probably read that. Hopefully they know their bosses, they know the situation. But there's sometimes you can do it, and there's other times you let sleeping dogs lie, maybe. So choose your battles.
Is it okay if I ask about the layoff thing?
Yeah, go ahead. I have an open book.
Because we're recording this during a time when we've seen news of a lot of companies laying tech workers off. So it might be helpful if you don't mind sharing what your mind goes through when something like that happens.
Boy, I want to answer this because, there might be people that don't know me, and I feel like not being egotistical or whatever, right? So I'm trying to make sure, like, it was hard at first. Like, of course you take it somewhat personally, right? And the scenario for me was like, I made it to the third round of layoffs. Like, they were coming, and I was in the third wave. And my whole thing was like, well, I'm the guy that does the SAN and the backups. I'm the only guy that does that. There's no way that they're going to get rid of me, because who's going to do that, right? Well, that lasted till the third round. And then they're like, yeah, you're out. So it was kind of hard, but the one thing I'll say is, like, for me personally, what I would share to people is, like, it's not personal usually. I mean, I'm sure there's sometimes, if you've done something wrong at work, there's something there, right? But if you're a good worker and it just comes down to bean counters or somebody in finance figuring stuff out, like, don't take it personally. But on the flip side of that was, I had confidence in my skill set. I knew I would find a job afterwards. And that's where this is the egotistical part that I worry about how this is going to sound on the recording. But I got laid off in November, told my wife, and this is Thanksgiving's coming up, and we had a huge Christmas holiday trip planned with my family. And it's like, what are we going to do? We're not going to have any money. And, and I'm like, it'll be fine, it'll be fine. But here's this, here's the thing we have to realize, like, I'll get unemployment. And the thing I knew is, like, I am not going to get any job interviews for like a month at least. Like, think about it. You're laid off in the middle of November. Like, I'm not going to see any movement. The goal should be, we'll think February timelines for a new job. Let's kind of just tighten the belts a little bit. There's things that I can work on. I started working on some more certifications to stay busy. Working the network. Now, this is pre-Twitter and pre-LinkedIn and pre, you know what I mean? So, but, work, again, I'll go back to some more relationships. Working the relationships and talking to folks. I ended up kind of just keep my head above water, and I ended up starting at Microsoft on like January 20th. So I was laid off in November 15th. I was basically out of work for 2 months, and picked up another job starting in January. Now, granted, I don't know what I didn't pay attention to the economics. Like, hey, was everybody laying off? The .coms were obviously struggling, but I trusted myself that I'm a little bit, I always say I'm a little bit better than the average bear. I'm a 7 out of 10, maybe a 6 out of 10, whatever. And I just felt like I would find something, and unfortunately I did. So, but I didn't take. I think the thing is, like, it's business. It's not a reflection on you. It's not Jason's not a good worker, a good person, or Nick's not a good person, a good worker, or Jason had it out for Nick.
He definitely did.
Yeah. I'm not saying that stuff doesn't happen, but I'm sure that's very minor.
I think I've not been through it. Okay, I can't say that I have been through it, but I've known several people who have had to go through this, and there are a lot of emotions that come up, and it has to be super hard not to question, oh, is there something wrong with me? What did I do? You can go down some rabbit holes on that.
Yeah, for us it was actually one of the best financial things that ever happened to me and my wife.
Oh, wow.
We had a house payment, we had 2 car payments, we had cell phones, we had the biggest internet package, we had the biggest cable TV package. And I'm not saying we weren't paying our bills, but like we were living, I don't want to say paycheck to paycheck, but like we were, keeping up with the Joneses.
Mm-hmm.
And when that happened, like I actually took my severance check and paid off my wife's car. We turned off our cable, all these other things. And we haven't had cable. I haven't had cable since 2002, like cable TV.
That's so cool.
But there's things that's helped. We've never had 2 car payments at the same time. That was just a dumb idea. But I was, 24.
It's a beautiful thing to not have 2 car payments.
Right. But don't take it personally. And the sun will come up. People will find other jobs and potentially better jobs.
Yep. Could be an opportunity you didn't realize. And to your point, lean on those personal network connections. See if you can get yourself some help.
Sorry. When I started at Microsoft on the team, I brought along 2 of my buddies that got riffed from Disney. I got hired. They're like, hey, we need 2 more. And I'm like, I got the exact guys for you. A buddy of mine named Steve and a buddy of mine named Mike. They joined, and that was great. We worked a lot. We worked on a fun project, but we were friends, and it was a good time. If anybody has any questions, hit me up on Twitter. We can talk directly. And
Jason's a great guy to talk to. You should definitely take him up on that. How about this one? At some point, you became more of an architect as opposed to what we would call an administrator. Can you describe that progression a little bit for us and what the real difference is between what we might call a systems administrator and more of an architect?
And I would call that like the act 2 of my career. I'm a big movie buff. I would say so. Act 1, I was like the up and coming, meaning doing up and coming in my career, phone support, sysadmin stuff that we've touched on, whether it be at Disney, Xbox. There's a couple other things sprinkled in there, right? Sysadmin work is a lot of like, there's some project work in there, but most of it's break fix work, I would say. Like maybe you're refreshing something every now and then, but a lot of times it's helping somebody fix a problem or server's not working or whatever. And when I got into kind of the quote unquote architecture type role, that was like act 2 of my career. And that's when I actually moved into working at a VAR and being a consultant. That kind of came from, we won't go over the resume, but I switched jobs a lot. Like part of it, like we talked about, was getting paid, but the other part was like, I like to build things. I finally figured that out later on. It's like, I've always liked Legos. I like building PCs. Like, I don't like maintaining things, like sitting there and just waiting for the widget to break or wait for the latest updates. So that got me into the VAR life, as I call it, or value reseller life. And that progression of getting out of the idea of my day-to-day job being break fix, and I'm being very generic here as a term, and getting into and like having business outcome conversations or problem solving on a larger scale for customers, right? Like some of it is still going in and saying, hey, I've got this little problem. How do I fix it? And it might be, oh, here's a new piece of software or new storage device or whatever. Or it's meeting with higher level executives at a bank, and they're like, hey, we've hit a certain threshold of assets, and we need to make sure that we have a full business continuity disaster recovery plan, right? And they're not as concerned with the things below, meaning like, are we doing stretch layer 2? Are we using OTV? Are we using VXLAN? They don't care about any of that. They're like, I just need to make these requirements. And then it's that conversation of business outcomes and how you achieve those. And that's kind of where the architecture piece comes in, of understanding the technology to a point of not all the way down into the weeds at that level, because that's not really what the role is. It's knowing what the software or the solution is, right? Because it could be different things, obviously. But how you use that technology to deliver and solve business outcomes that the folks that are paying the bills care about, and having those kind of conversations. And that's kind of what I was doing at GCSIT, the VAR I was at. I mean, I started off as a deployment guy, but kind of moved up into doing the architecture work. That's kind of more of it. So you get the technical chops, right? You get the speeds and feeds conversations, but then it's more like you start trying to figure out, like, how do I engage with like the managers? And then it's like, how do I engage with the directors? And how do I engage with VPs? And it's like you kind of build up that talk track and that conversationalism. And it's not about, hey, let me go to the whiteboard and draw a really cool diagram, or make a really cool Visio. You and I were joking about, is architecture about Visios. 100% making good diagrams helps, but that's only part. It's only part of it, right?
What made you want to progress in that direction? So you mentioned, I want to go and be able to talk to frontline managers, directors, VPs. I don't think everybody wants to do that, and I think, to your point, that you have to learn how to talk in the language that those folks understand and are looking for.
For me, it was the passions has to be there, right? If you're not into it, you're not into it, and you're not gonna go there. That's not your career arc or your path. I got more involved on the business side at the VAR as well. You think more about like how businesses are working, right? And that started to intrigue me. The passion for the technology was there, but knowing every knob and lever and checkbox to click was kind of like, I'd been doing that at this point, for 15 years. I'm kind of over that. I want to know how it works. I want to know what it does, but I don't need to know that I want to check this box for super fast and, uncheck or turn this thing for that. So it was more like, how do I advance? And that started interesting me more, of like having those conversations. And I actually really like writing documentation.
It is fun.
That's an architect, like that's an element of an architect's job, is documenting, not just making the Visios, but like writing out words, and documenting out. And I actually really enjoy that. Oddly enough, I never would have guessed that. But those kind of things just kind of progressed, and it was showing, again, that business value, those business cases, not always having the stump the chump conversations. Like, I enjoy those. Those are great. But it's like, sometimes like, oh man, I don't want to have an IOPS drag race conversation again, or a feature comparison matrix conversation.
When you were the person who was doing the implementation at the value-added reseller, were you given the implementation plan by someone who was in an architect role, or did you have to come up with that on your own?
So at first, no. When I first got there, no. And that wasn't for lack of trying. It was just everybody's just moving a million miles an hour. But as I moved up in that organization, did the architecture work, and then became a practice manager, and then kind of the head of the systems team, those types of things came out because we got into bigger projects, you get bigger opportunities, you're working with larger customers. Those types of things start to become expected, right? If you're going in and you're doing a quick, VMware deployment, it's only a couple hosts, whatever, the expectation is you're not going to turn over a run book to them, more than likely. I'm using a wide brush here. But to that example of the bank or the credit union, like they wanted implementation guides and all that. That's all technical writing and stuff like that. So we got to that point. I helped develop that along with some of the other folks on the team. I'm not going to take full credit for it. I'm not saying that, but we got more process oriented and kind of that process where now it's like, if I was the deployment engineer, I had at least a book kind of built with some diagrams. Like I knew what was the expectations were, because usually, Usually the person that sold it compared to the person who designed it, and then the person, those usually are not the same in any organization. They might be involved a little bit, but they're not owning it from cradle to grave.
Hopefully they're all communicating though.
Right. There, we did that. We had turnover meetings, like all that kind of process was built in, was started to build that in. That goes back to another comment of relationships, because I started knowing other folks in the VMware community that worked at other VARs. So you can sort of like, you'd be frenemies. It's like, especially if they're in your same territory, but you kind of hear like how other people are doing things, and you would kind of figure out how other folks are doing it, look at your own processes and just say, all right, we can fit that in or do that. So.
Yeah, and real quick aside, we talked a little bit about what partners were and the difference about different classifications of partners in our discussions with Andrew Miller that I'll link back to for other people. But some partners resell software and or hardware and potentially have a competency in a particular software. But I just wanted to point that out because you mentioned that you are or were a practice manager. Can you explain what that means and what your responsibilities were as a result?
Yeah. Side note, real funny that you mentioned Andrew Miller. We'll do a little name game here. Andrew Miller worked with a guy named Jason Nash, who was like the main VMware guy at Vero, who I met at VMware PTAB, and he was kind of a mentor to me. So that's kind of full circle. Yeah, right. Like again, back to that relationship thing that's going to come up. Like, so that's funny. And Andrew's actually at Pure. He's a great guy. From the to your practice manager question, I've seen it implemented a little different ways depending on who you talk to. But really, it was like I was the practice manager for end user compute as it related to VMware, right? So Horizon View and then Workspace ONE and blah blah that portfolio. So what that meant was I was kind of like, how do I train? Not me train them specifically, but get the right training for our SEs to be competent both in pre-sales, post-sales, design and architecture. How do we come up with standardized bill of materials, and like what pieces of software and hardware do we put in our portfolio to build that solution? Meaning like, okay, yes, it's going to be a VMware stack, but are we going to use, we use Dell Compute, and this is going to sound really funny, but like the very first EUC job I did, I deployed a Pure Storage array. Guess what? I work at Pure Storage now, back in 2013. So it was kind of like figuring out how you run that practice and think of it like as its own business unit or its own entity. We're going to do X amount of revenue through EUC work and projects. So whether that's consulting, deployment, maybe somebody just buys the solution and they deploy it themselves or whatever. So that's kind of what the practice, for us, that's what practice management. And then I was also meeting with like our VMware representation of like, hey, we need to make sure you guys are selling X amount of Horizon. I'm meeting with Dell folks and they're saying, hey, you need to sell X amount of servers, and NVIDIA is saying you need to sell X amount of GPU, so in the VAR world, I always say you have mini masters because everybody wants you to sell their thing.
Right, because it amplifies revenue for whatever company or vendor you're partnering with.
100%. They can't scale. That's why partners exist, right? Like it's either to help with deployment or they can't scale their sales force to hit everybody. That's just kind of one of, there's lots of reasons, but those are kind of some of the main reasons why that partner ecosystem is important for VMware and other companies that use the channel to sell through. So that's what the practice manager was. So I was like coming up with business plans and figuring out how we're going to position this and how we're going to attack this, how we're going to do assessments, what a statement of work looks like, all that kind of stuff, right? So kind of that architecture piece, but also a little bit of the business piece of like, how do we make money off doing this to make sure we're not losing money off deployments, that type of stuff.
Did the technical teams, pre-sales, post-sales, implementation, did they all report to you in this role? Or was it like a dotted line kind of thing?
Not at that time. Yeah, it's more like a dotted line because I would help them with pre-sales conversations, or like I said, or the enablement and the training and whatnot, but I was not like their manager. I wasn't making sure that, they were taking PTO or their time cards were in or, any of that type of stuff. It was just more like, hey, and I should also say like, it was also not just enabling the SEs, it was also enabling AEs to have those conversations as well.
Those are account executives or full-on salespeople.
Right. People use different terms, but yeah, so it wasn't just the SEs. I should make that clear. That's only one part. Right now you had account folks like, okay, what kind of use cases are good? healthcare, like what kind of stuff you run into healthcare. Usually they're looking for, they want to use iPads, or they want to use key card or key fobs to like quickly log in as they move from patient room. So understand kind of like the business value and those types of conversations, right? So it was the selling side and the technical side.
Well, you actually manage the relationships with these partners. You were talking about it earlier. That's kind of similar to managing employees in a way, because you can kind of hire and fire them, can't you?
So when I did the practice manager stuff for a little while, then I forgot the title, but then I kind of ran the SE organization for the system side. And what that means, because we had networking folks and we had systems, meaning like they did the server, the storage, that type of infrastructure. We had a networking team that did all the route switch firewalling. But then I also managed the business relationships with our partners, meaning the vendors that we resold. So the Veeams of the world, the Pures, like I said, the Dell EMCs at that time, VMware, and everybody's like, hey, you need to do so many webinars or conferences, trying to keep everybody happy. And it makes for strange bedfellows, but it was fun. We were successful at it. I'd like to think. We won an award. I got to shake hands with Pat Gelsinger and accept the award for our VMware practice, which was really cool. It could be a headache too, so there's like, sometimes you had some really weird, interesting conversations, right? And hopefully back to our, like, it's business, it's not personal. I try to do my best to navigate those. I always try to be upfront and honest and kept my word with folks. That was a mini masters kind of management, because they all want you to have so many people certified. You talked about the master services competency, like that you have to have so many certain SE certified on their platforms and that type of stuff. So that was a lot of fun.
If somebody out there is looking to switch jobs and you want to get a bunch of certifications, working for a value-added reseller as a consultant could be a really good thing, because they need those certifications to keep their relationships hot with the technology vendors that they're partnering with.
Yeah, there's financial reasons for a lot of that make it nice. And when I went to the VAR scene, I had already mentioned before I was doing certs. At this point, I was kind of heavily drinking the VMware Kool-Aid. I was like, I want to make this more of my career. So that was very attractive to folks that I was talking to, is like, I came with those certs. Like they didn't have to pay to send me to training. I don't know if the VCP still costs money, but that was like there used to be a training class you had to pay for to even you could still sit the exam, but you couldn't earn the cert, if I remember right, without actually, sitting the training.
100%.
So yeah, if, for folks that are out there, like, it's a good arc, customer side, the VAR side, there's a lot of value. You could doing that. I learned a lot, like doing the VAR stuff that I had no idea that I was even getting into when I got out of working, like, on, being a day-to-day sysadmin, or what we would refer to being, on the customer side. It was interesting, but I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the relationship thing real quick, Nick. I don't know how we're doing on time, but
doing fine.
I got the VAR job, or the opportunity to interview with some VARs, because when I worked at Microsoft, I worked with a gentleman who I'm still friends with to this day, who introduced me to a woman that that became friends with and still friends with to this day, who managed the Seattle area VARs for VMware. So I sent her my resume, and she did all the legwork for me of getting my resume in front of the various VARs in the Seattle area.
Wow. Relationships matter.
Yeah. If I would tell anybody, like, again, I think I'm above average, from a smart perspective, but the relationships and being a kind of a people person, goes so hand in hand with my career. I feel very fortunate in that regard. So making relationships, building those bridges, and it's a lot easier now with I sound like the old man yelling at the cloud, but in the last 10 years, those things it's gotten way easier to kind of build those bridges.
Completely agree. In this role where you manage the solution engineers, systems engineers, you were managing the partner relationships at the same time? If you're someone out there who's listening and looking to take the next step in your career, maybe working for a value-added reseller is the next step. It's a great way, like Jason and I talked about, to get technology certifications. And it's a really good way to work with a variety of different kinds of customers instead of just in one customer environment if you work for a specific company. Gives you a wide range of experience that's really valuable. And you can work with different technologies, different types of products, different vendor products that make up a single solution for a customer of the value-added reseller. On the certification piece, some people work on those at night when they have time, early mornings, during lunch. For Jason, he had to study when he had time, and that was when things were a little bit slower. He was working overnights and he was studying a book, and he had a number of certifications that he ended up taking to this value-added reseller that really made him an attractive hire. I love the discussion of his phone support job and explaining hard concepts in simple terms. You have to be able to do that for less technical individuals on the other side of the phone. But what's a really interesting parallel to that is you have to be able to do that when you are an architect. It's not that you have to dumb it down, but you do have to explain what kind of outcome do I get from using this technology. Yeah, it's great. It's the new hotness. It's the new thing. It's exciting. It's faster, but what does that do for the business? How does that solve a problem? I think the being able to explain hard things in simple ways is a skill that not everyone has, along with meeting someone you're speaking to at the appropriate technical level. You've probably done it just as I have, launched into a discussion that was way too technical for the person you were speaking to, and hopefully, as that happens to you more and more, you'll be able to notice, course correct, and get faster at detecting what's the right level of technicality for this conversation. If you're someone out there who is asking for more projects to learn new things in your current role so that you can see what else is out there, work with other technologies, continue to build those skill sets, sometimes the answer is no. It may not be no forever, but it may be no right now. So you may have to think up some creative ideas for what more means for you. Maybe it's more training instead of different types of projects. Or maybe it's shadowing someone else, like Jason talked about, without even saying a word. Jason tells us that getting laid off was a financial wake-up call for him. He and his wife were keeping up with the Joneses, and they became a little bit better stewards of their finances as a result, more careful about the spending habits. He also tells us not to take the layoff personally. That has to be one of those pieces of advice that's really hard to hear and really hard to execute on. Hopefully you got a little bit of insight into what it means to manage a practice. For Jason, he managed the end-user computing practice for the value-added reseller, and he was in charge of the technology partners and maintaining the relationships with those partners. When you work for a value-added reseller like that, you are wanting to build solutions and deliver solutions to your customers, and it's probably going to be a multi-vendor solution. So you need stuff from a hardware vendor, a couple of different software vendors, maybe multiple hardware vendors, multiple software vendors, and someone who can execute on the implementation at the right scale with the right architecture that meets the customer needs. So it's really important that you pick the right components of the solution you're going to go to market with your customers. It works, it's validated, it's effective in delivering the things that you want to deliver for that practice so that your value-added reseller can make money, which is the end goal. But I just found it fascinating to learn about what it means to manage a specific practice. Maybe that's a future career step for someone like yourself, dear listener. You also heard a little bit of a hint toward the end there, or at least in the managing the practice section, we heard something about Jason managing people. we're actually going to hear more about that next time. A lot more, actually, because it wasn't the only time he's ever managed people. But that'll have to be next week. Just a reminder that we'd like people to subscribe and give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. We want to know if we're being helpful and are always looking for interesting questions to ponder. We're collectively on Twitter @NerdJourney. If this episode was encouraging to you, helpful for you, share it with a friend. Maybe they could use some tips and tricks, courtesy of Jason Langer. Farewell, listeners. Tune in next time as the journey continues. I'm Nick Cordy @NetworkNerd_, flying solo for now, for my buddy John White @VJourneyman, signing off.